Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're heading up north to Scandinavia.
Ah, Scandinavia. Always a fascinating region.
Indeed, especially when it comes to cybersecurity.
Definitely. They got a strong tech scene, a reputation for being forward-thinking.
But as we all know, a strong tech scene also means being in the crosshairs of cyber threats.
Right. And that's what we're going to dig into today using this 2024 cybersecurity report from Sweden's National Cybersecurity Center.
Kind of a snapshot of Sweden's cyber landscape, the good, the bad, and the concerning, to say the least.
Absolutely. And one of the things that immediately jumps out from the report is just how diverse the threats are.
Yeah. The report uses this term,
Hotakter, yeah.
Yeah.
It basically covers the whole spectrum of bad actors, from state-sponsored groups with serious resources and capabilities
Yeah.
to organized crime looking to make a quick buck. And let's not forget about the ideologically motivated hackers.
Right. Those who are driven by a cause, a belief system.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And each of these groups has different motives, different targets, different methods.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all situation when it comes to defending against them.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
You need a multi-layered approach, a deep understanding of the evolving threat landscape.
And speaking of different motives, the report uses this term, advanced persistent threats, or APT.
Ah, yes, APTs. It does sound a bit like something out of a spy movie, doesn't it?
It really does. I mean, who are we talking about here?
Basically, think of them as the elite hackers. Highly skilled, incredibly well-funded, often backed by nation-states.
And they're not just in it for, like, a quick hit and run, right?
Yeah, no, that's what makes them so dangerous. They're patient. They can infiltrate a network and stay hidden for months, sometimes even years, quietly gathering intel, waiting for the right moment to strike.
So basically, they're playing the long game.
Exactly. And they're masters of disguise. The report actually points out that attribution, figuring out who's behind an attack, is one of the biggest challenges in cybersecurity.
I can imagine. It seems like it would be incredibly difficult to trace these attacks back to the source.
Oh, it definitely is. These APTs use all sorts of sophisticated techniques to cover their tracks. Proxy servers, constantly changing their tools and tactics. Sometimes they even compromise each other's infrastructure to throw investigators off the scent.
It's like trying to follow a trail of breadcrumbs that keeps disappearing.
That's a great analogy. You're constantly one step behind.
Hmm.
But every now and then you get a break. There have been cases, and the report mentions this, where Swedish authorities have been able to piece together enough evidence to attribute an attack with a high degree of certainty.
Okay, so sometimes the good guys do win.
Well, sometimes. It's a constant cat and mouse game, that's for sure.
So we've got these different actors, different motives, but what about their methods? How are they actually carrying out these attacks?
Well, the report dives into that as well. And it's not just your typical phishing emails, although those are still, unfortunately, very much in play.
I was going to say, everyone knows about phishing by now.
Right. But the attackers are getting more sophisticated. They're always coming up with new ways to exploit vulnerabilities. One method that's highlighted in the report, and it's been increasingly common, is something called a watering hole attack.
Watering hole, that sounds almost peaceful.
Deceptively so. The analogy is quite apt. Imagine a predator waiting at a watering hole knowing its prey has to come there for a drink.
Okay, I'm starting to see where this is going.
Right. In the cyber world, this means attackers compromising websites that are frequently visited by their intended targets. Could be a popular industry forum, a professional networking site, something like that. They infect the site with malware and wait for their victims to take a sip.
It's a clever strategy. They're not directly targeting individuals. They're going after the places where they know those individuals will congregate.
Exactly. And the report gives a real-world example of this. A Swedish engineering firm was targeted through a compromised website belonging to their industry association. They were after an intellectual property specifically related to a sensitive defense project.
So not just any data, but highly valuable strategic information.
Right. The stakes are high,
Yeah.
and then you have the supply chain attacks.
Yeah.
These are even more insidious because you're essentially being attacked indirectly.
Yeah, I've heard about these. You're vulnerable because of the companies or services you rely on.
Exactly. Imagine a company that develops software used by, let's say, hundreds of other organizations. If attackers can compromise that company, inject malware into their software updates, we'll suddenly have a backdoor into all those other organizations.
It's like poisoning the well.
In a way, yes. And the report specifically mentions a case where a popular Swedish open source code library was found to have malicious code embedded in it Fortunately, it was caught before it could do too much damage.
But it highlights a growing trend, a very worrying one at that.
Oh, absolutely. It's a reminder that even if your own defenses are strong, you're still vulnerable if the tools and software you rely on are compromised. It's a whole ecosystem of risk. And speaking of ecosystems, the report also dives into something that might seem a bit, well, low-tech in this age of all things digital: physical security.
Yeah, it's easy to forget about the real world when we're so focused on the virtual one.
Exactly. But as the report points out, sometimes the simplest things can be the most dangerous.
They actually use the example of a misplaced USB stick.
Right. You'd think we'd all know better by now, but apparently not.
So how does that even work? Someone finds a USB stick lying around, plugs it into their computer.
And boom, malware spreading through the network.
It sounds almost too easy.
It often is. Curiosity gets the better of us. We see a USB stick labeled confidential. We can't resist.
So what's the takeaway here?
Don't plug in random USB sticks you find. Seriously, though, it highlights the need for organizations to think beyond just their digital defenses. Physical security matters. Controlling access to sensitive areas, educating employees about the risks, even something as seemingly innocuous as a USB stick.
Okay, so a good reminder that cybersecurity is a holistic thing.
Absolutely. And that leads us to the next part of the report, which I found really insightful. The section called Brister och Berönd, which basically translates to weaknesses and dependencies.
Weaknesses and dependencies. Sounds intriguing. What's the gist of it?
It's all about the challenges organizations face in maintaining a strong security posture. And, some of these challenges are pretty common, pretty widespread.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, take procurement and outsourcing, for instance. More and more organizations are relying on third-party vendors for everything from software to cloud services, even security solutions.
Right, makes sense. It's all about specialization these days.
Sure, but it also introduces a whole new level of risk. You're essentially extending your attack surface, creating more points of vulnerability.
So even if your own defenses are strong, you could be undermined by a weak link in your supply chain.
Precisely. And the report highlights how many organizations aren't doing enough due diligence when it comes to their vendors' security practices. They might have all the right policies in place internally, but if their vendors are lax, it creates a huge gap.
It's like having a high-security vault with a flimsy back door.
Exactly. And the report doesn't mince words. It stresses the need for clear security requirements for vendors, active monitoring, and regular audits to make sure they're actually complying.
So it's about accountability, making sure everyone in that chain is pulling their weight.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the whole cloud services issue. We can't talk about cybersecurity these days without talking about the cloud.
Right, so many benefits, but also, as the report acknowledges, some unique security challenges.
It's a double-edged sword, isn't it? On the one hand, the cloud can provide access to really sophisticated security tools and expertise, things that many organizations wouldn't be able to afford on their own.
True. It's like having a whole team of security professionals at your fingertips.
Exactly. But on the flip side, you're essentially entrusting your data and applications to a third party.
So it's about trust, but also about understanding the shared responsibility model.
Yes. The report goes into detail about that, emphasizing that both the cloud provider and the customer have roles to play. You can't just assume the cloud provider is taking care of everything.
You need to be proactive, understand where your responsibilities lie.
Absolutely. Things like configuring access controls, encrypting sensitive data, those are on you.
Okay, so cloud security, definitely a mixed bag.
Definitely something to consider carefully.
Yeah.
And then there's the issue that just won't go away: the shortage of skilled cybersecurity professionals.
Ah, yes, the skills gap. It feels like everyone's talking about it, but it's not getting any better.
The report doesn't sugarcoat it. It's a major problem in Sweden, as it is in many other countries. There simply aren't enough qualified people to fill all of the cybersecurity roles that are out there.
And I imagine that shortage has real-world consequences, right?
Absolutely. It leaves organizations more vulnerable to attacks. Think about it. If you don't have enough skilled people to manage your defenses, to respond to incidents, you're at a significant disadvantage.
So it's not just about technology, it's about having the right people in place to use that technology effectively.
Exactly. And the report goes beyond just lamenting the problem. It offers some solutions, some ways to address this skills gap.
Like what?
Well, one thing it emphasizes is the importance of investing in training and development programs.
So upskilling existing employees, bringing new people into the field.
Exactly. Both internally and in partnership with educational institutions.
So it's about building for the future, creating a pipeline of talent.
Right. And it's not just about technical skills, it's also about soft skills. Things like communication, collaboration, problem solving. These are all essential for cybersecurity professionals.
So we've talked about the threats, the weaknesses, but the report doesn't just leave us hanging, does it?
No, it doesn't. It actually dedicates a whole section to recommendations, concrete steps that organizations can take to improve their cybersecurity posture.
Okay, so a bit of hope after all the doom and gloom.
Exactly. And these recommendations cover a wide range of areas, from incident response planning to network security to software management.
Let's dive into some of these. Give me the highlights. What are some of the key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, one of the most important, and this comes up again and again in the report, is the importance of having a robust incident response plan.
It seems obvious, but I suspect many organizations still don't have a solid plan in place.
You're probably right. But the report makes it clear, no matter how strong your defenses are, breaches can and do happen.
So it's not about if you'll be attacked, but when.
Right. And when that happens, you need to know exactly what to do.
Not just react in a panic.
Exactly. A well-defined plan outlines roles and responsibilities, communication procedures, escalation paths. It ensures that everyone knows what to do, who to contact, how to contain the damage.
And it's not just about putting out the fire, is it?
No, it's also about recovery, getting back to business as usual, as quickly as possible. The report actually provides a framework for developing an incident response plan.
So a good starting point for organizations that don't know where to begin.
Definitely. And it
Yeah.
stresses the importance of testing the plan regularly.
So it's not just a document that sits on a shelf gathering dust.
Right. You get to practice, run drills, see how it works in a simulated environment, identify gaps, refine procedures, make sure everyone knows their role.
So like a fire drill, but for cybersecurity.
Exactly. And speaking of drills, let's talk about another key recommendation. One that's often overlooked, but incredibly important. Installing security updates promptly.
Ah, yes, the dreaded updates. I think we've all been guilty of ignoring those notifications at some point.
We all have. But the report makes it clear, delaying updates is one of the biggest risks you can take.
Why is that?
Because attackers are constantly scanning for systems with known vulnerabilities.
And a lot of times those vulnerabilities are addressed in updates.
Exactly. So if you're not installing those updates, you're essentially leaving the door wide open for attackers.
And it's not just about our computers, right? It's about all software, applications, even firmware.
Right. Everything needs to be kept up to date.
Because a vulnerability in one system can have a ripple effect, can compromise the whole network.
Exactly. The report even gives a real-world example of this. A Swedish manufacturing company that delayed installing a critical security update for their VPN software. They ended up getting breached through that very vulnerability. Sensitive customer data was stolen, significant financial losses.
Yeah.
Not good.
A cautionary tale for sure.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, we've talked about incident response, we've talked about updates. What else is high on the list?
Well, what about those all-powerful admin accounts we talked about earlier? The report mentions managing high-level privileges.
Ah, yes, the keys to the kingdom. The report goes into detail about how to minimize the risks associated with those accounts.
So it's about being stingy with those admin rights, right?
Exactly. The principle of least privilege, that's the key. Meaning users should only have access to the systems and data they absolutely need to do their jobs. No more, no less.
Sounds straightforward in theory.
It is, but it requires careful planning, role-based access controls, regular audits to make sure those privileges haven't drifted. The report even suggests using separate accounts for administrative tasks.
So you wouldn't use your everyday account to make system-level changes?
Right. That way, if your everyday account gets compromised, the attacker doesn't automatically have admin access.
Another layer of protection.
Exactly. And then, of course, strong authentication, especially for those privileged accounts.
Strong passwords, multi-factor authentication, all that good stuff.
Yep, the report covers it all. But let's not forget about network security, another crucial area.
Right, we talked earlier about the importance of segmentation, dividing your network into separate compartments, like a house with locked doors between rooms.
That's a great analogy, and the report goes into detail about how to do that effectively. Having separate segments for administrative systems, user devices, guest networks, it's about limiting the blast radius, containing the damage if one part of the network is compromised.
So even if an attacker gets a foothold, they can't easily move laterally.
Precisely. And along with segmentation comes access control, making sure that only authorized users and devices can access those different segments.
Right. Strong authentication, network filtering, monitoring tools, all those things play a role.
Absolutely. And remember, we discussed unauthorized devices on the network.
The rogue USB stick scenario.
Exactly. Well, the report also addresses that. It emphasizes the importance of having a clear policy for device management, requiring device registration, network access control lists, security software on all devices. It's about being in control of what's connecting to your network.
Okay, so we've covered incident response, network security, anything else in this section?
Well, before we move on, I want to touch on one more thing. It's about software management. We've talked about updates, but the report goes further. It stresses the need to ensure that only approved software can run on your systems.
Ah, you're talking about whitelisting. Yeah.
Exactly. Creating a list of trusted applications and blocking everything else. It's another way to prevent malware from infiltrating your systems.
Makes sense. You're only letting in the good guys.
Precisely. And the report even suggests using a modern operating system that requires all software to be digitally signed.
So you know it's coming from a legitimate source and hasn't been tampered with.
Right. And speaking of software, we can't forget about hardware. The report emphasizes the need to upgrade both regularly.
Because older systems are more vulnerable to attack.
Exactly. They might not have the latest security blotches. They might be running outdated operating systems. It's like driving an old car without airbags or anti-lock brakes.
Yeah.
You're putting yourself at unnecessary risk.
Okay, so a lot to consider here, but it seems like the report is really trying to empower organizations, give them the tools they need to defend themselves.
I think that's a fair assessment. It's about being proactive, understanding the risks, taking the necessary steps to mitigate them.
And it's not just about organizations, is it? Individuals also have a role to play.
Absolutely. And the report touches on that as well. It provides some specific recommendations for individuals to enhance their own cybersecurity.
Well, perfect. Let's dive into that in the next part of our deep dive.
So let's shift gears a bit and talk about what individuals can do to protect themselves. Because at the end of the day, cybersecurity is everyone's responsibility.
Right. We're all potential targets, whether we work for a big corporation or just browse the internet at home.
Exactly. And the report actually dedicates a section to practical tips for individuals, which is great. It's not all about high-level technical stuff. Some of it is just common sense.
Well, let's hear it. Common sense, uncommon tips. Bring it on.
Okay, well, first and foremost, strong passwords.
Thank you.
I know we've all heard it a million times, but it's still so important.
It's the foundation of good security hygiene.
Right. And the report goes beyond just saying, use strong passwords. It gives specific guidelines, like make sure your password is at least 12 characters long, use a mix of upper and lowercase letters, numbers, and symbols, and don't use the same password for multiple accounts.
Password managers can be really helpful for that. They can generate strong, unique passwords for you and store them securely.
Absolutely. And then, of course, enable multi-factor authentication whenever possible.
Another layer of protection.
Right. It makes it much harder for attackers to gain access to your accounts, even if they do manage to steal your password. And speaking of stealing passwords, let's talk about phishing.
Ah, yes. The classic phishing email.
It's still one of the most common attack methods. But the good news is that with a little bit of awareness, you can protect yourself. The report gives some great tips for spotting phishing emails.
Like what?
Well, look out for suspicious sender addresses. Be wary of emails that create a sense of urgency, like you have to click on a link right away or something bad will happen. And be careful about opening attachments from unknown senders.
Those attachments can contain malware that can infect your computer.
Exactly. And if you're ever unsure about an email, don't click on any links, don't open any attachments. Contact the supposed sender directly to verify the email's legitimacy. Better safe than sorry.
Good advice.
And then, of course, keep your software up to date. We talked about this in the context of organizations, but it's just as important for individuals.
Because those updates often contain security patches that fix vulnerabilities.
Exactly. So don't ignore those update notifications and make sure you're running a good antivirus program and that it's also kept up to date.
And back up your important data regularly, just in case.
Oh yeah, backups are crucial. Whether it's to an external hard drive or a cloud storage service, make sure you have copies of your important files.
So strong passwords, multi-factor authentication, beware of phishing, keep your software up to date, back up your data. That's a pretty good starting point, isn't it?
It is. And the report also touches on some other things, like being careful about what information you share online.
Social media, online forums, that kind of thing.
Right. Think before you post.
Yeah.
Don't share sensitive personal information, like your home address or financial details.
And be careful about clicking on links from unknown sources.
Yep. You never know where those links might lead you.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about the threats, the vulnerabilities, and the recommendations. What's the key takeaway here?
I think the key takeaway is that cybersecurity is an ongoing process. It's not something you do once and then forget about it. The threat landscape is constantly evolving, so we need to be vigilant, stay informed, and adapt our defenses accordingly.
It's a shared responsibility. We all have a role to play in keeping ourselves and our data safe.
Exactly. Whether you're an individual, a business, or a government agency, we all need to work together to create a more secure digital world.
Well said. That's a great note to end on. A huge thanks to you for joining us for this deep dive into the Swedish cybersecurity landscape. And to all our listeners, stay safe out there, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.